My name is Dena. I work as an educator at the National Gallery of Art doing family programs. And this workshop is meant to be participatory, so please join me in being fully immersed and fully engaged as much as you are able to today. With the chat, we're going to invite some voice out loud comments as well, if you're comfortable with that, to share our ideas, our creativity. So we'll talk about curricular connections and taking this back to your classroom towards the end. But if we run out of time for Q&A, I'll be sure to leave you with my contact information so that we can take time to talk after today. But today during our time, we're going to be doing three things. We're going to be discovering some quilts from Gee's Bend, Alabama. We'll meet the quilters who made them, hear a little bit about their stories. We'll consider how having a strong sense of self, of our identity, where we come from, how that can be a form of activism. And we'll also make our learning personal. We'll be grounding it in the physical and making it visible by doing a short hands-on art making exercise today. Hopefully nothing too intimidating for those who are feeling less artsy or don't feel like they have a creative bone in their body, but something that we can hopefully make accessible to you that you can then make accessible to your students. And I know that today, or I know that in your classrooms or in your context, you would have much more time to create and develop a lesson like this. Today is really just giving you a sampling of what I might recommend for students. And of course, you would elongate it or adjust the time for it to allow the students to be as creative as possible and within your time constraints. So today will really be about exposing you to a lesson and to give you some ideas to take back to your context. So let's go ahead and begin with a quick warm-up exercise. And for this exercise, just grab your piece of paper and pencil. And I want you to think of a memory that stands out to you. It could just be something that pops to mind right away. Maybe it was eating a delicious bagel from the bagel shop last weekend. It could be a memory from your childhood, whatever comes out to you.
Folks who work with a wide variety of kids, a wide variety of ages, a wide variety of places. We probably have a wide variety of support. We probably have a wide variety of energy and background knowledge, and we all have kids that
I'm trying to figure out who that is. Sorry.
That's okay. Just making sure we're not missing someone who needs support. Okay, cool. Thank you. So yeah, think of a memory, whatever comes to mind. Could be something from childhood, could be from something last week. It could be a delicious dinner that you had with your family. I want you just to write on your piece of paper 3 symbols that you associate with that memory. And if you can, try to connect those symbols to the 5 senses, something you can touch, taste, smell, hear, or see. So if it was a beautiful dinner that you remember your family made last week, maybe it would be something that you could touch, or maybe it would be the pot that you cooked your soup in. So just 5 symbols. If your memory, for example, is maybe barbecue cookouts when you were a kid with your family on the 4th of July, maybe you would add watermelon, because that's like a classic summer fruit on a hot summer day. Maybe you would add fireworks as a symbol, something that you would hear. So go ahead, don't take too much time or overthink this, but just a couple of symbols that would represent those memories for you. And you can just drop it in the corner of your paper, somewhere to the side. This is going to be some of our pre-thinking for our art making, a little bit of brainstorming. And Jen, you were wondering about, will we get the slideshow after? Yeah, I can figure out how to package it and send it over. I'll get in touch with Aileen to make sure that we get that over to you. It might just take a little bit to make sure I can send over large files, because we've got a lot of pictures in here. All right. Hopefully you've got your memory down, your symbols associated with that memory. And we're going to go ahead and dive right into Meet the Quilters. And I'm, again, really giving a very brief, broad overview of Gee's Bend and the Gee's Bend Quilters, because there's so much that we can really say about this. And today we are just giving you that little taste or that nugget that you can hopefully expand into back to your classroom. So again, there's much more history that I'm going to be having to leave out intentionally for today, but really there's a lot that you can really delve into with this community. But the residents of Gee's Bend, Alabama, are direct descendants of enslaved people. They come from this area along the Alabama River that's located in this hairpin turn of the river. And these descendants have stayed in this area and have created community in this area. And so cultural traditions like quilt making have flourished and have been nourished because of this continuity of history and of family in this geographic location. And Gee's Bend is known for its colorful quilts, pattern quilts. And when we talk about the quilters from Gee's Bend, what comes to mind is family, familial connections, community, and sharing and exchanging ideas and creativity. Quilting is often a familial or extended familial community affair. And especially among women, they gather to quilt. They gather, when they gather, they exchange stories and memories, and they share this quilting legacy with the next generation. And we're going to see examples of that within some of the quilters that we'll meet today. So let's dive right in and take a look at our first quilt. And this will be a little bit of a looking exercise as well as a meet the quilters. This first quilt is by the artist Mary Lee Bendall. This is a quick picture of her, so we can just meet her, know her face. I'm just going to jump back to our quilt for a moment. She created this quilt in 2002 from wool and cotton and corduroy. So perhaps maybe what comes to mind is, oh, these are items that we often associate with clothing. So I want you to just set your pencils down for a moment. Don't worry about writing anything down just yet. And I want you to allow your eyes to take in this quilt. Maybe let your eyes scan from top to bottom, side to side, all four corners. Invite your eyes to just take notice with your mind of whatever colors jump out at you, any shapes that you're noticing, perhaps any patterns that are emerging within this quilt. Maybe as you're taking in this quilt, you're noticing colors that Mary Lee Bendall uses quite often, and maybe colors that only appear a certain number of times. So as we're taking in this quilt, I want you to open up your chats again and go ahead and pop something in that you're noticing in this quilt. Let's add some of our observations to the chat and just tell me about what's coming, what you're noticing, what's jumping out at you. And let's see if we can make some discoveries with our eyes together. Yeah, so Dr. G, noticing the turquoise. So noticing some of the colors that are coming through. Yes, yes, what are you noticing? Pops of orange. Oh, it's coming fast. Okay, wondering why there's only one yellow rectangle, the sense of dimension. Yeah, this is quite a big quilt. As you're popping these into the chat, I'll say that Mary Lee Bendall was born in 1935. And reminds Nicola of fields. They're all rectangular shape. Nicole's noticing colors reminding you of the elements, earth, fire, water, etc. Noticing these warm colors like the orange. Perhaps we're noticing blue symbolizing the river. So thinking again about symbols, we were thinking about symbols in our own personal histories too. Looks a bit like a bookshelf, some of the different size shapes that are loosely fitting together. These are fabulous. These are all really wonderful. This is a wonderful exercise to invite your learners, especially your young learners, invite them into the process of looking and noticing, and that can help them feel connected to what we're looking at. She is known for her crazy quilts. This is a term that she sort of endearingly calls her quilts because she doesn't follow a pattern. She works improvisationally, and she learned from watching her mother make quilts. So a little bit of background there. Yeah, the border changes. So noticing that frame along the border, perhaps even we might imagine that maybe she ran out of one fabric and then she decided to continue with a different fabric, or that wasn't there the next day when she came back. So she decided to use a different fabric. So there's a lot of variation and a lot of improvisation that's dictating this work of art, this quilt. Yeah, noticing the textures. Yeah, Denise, going back to this idea that it's wool and corduroy and cotton. So you can imagine if anyone's ever had like a corduroy jacket or corduroy pants, the texture of that, the warmth of that, the wool, the heaviness of wool, the weightiness of wool. So there's a lot that's very tactile and so visual about this quilt. So thank you all so much for just engaging in that quick looking exercise. And I'll sort of set my workshop hat aside for a second to say, like, this is something that we always do with works of art as we warm up our eyes and warm up to get to know as an entry point into exploring art together with our students. And it's a great way to just invite all observations, associations to the forefront, knowing that there's no wrong answer here. It's just about what your lens is and what you're coming in and your association. So I invite you to try this exercise with your students if art is a part of your teaching context. So we're going to move on to our next quilt because I want you all to get a sampling of them. This again was Mary Lee Bendolph. Our next quilter, Mary L. Bennett, with the Lazy Gal variation. So Mary L. Bennett was born in 1942. And as a young child of around 10 or 11, she worked in the fields hoeing and picking cotton, harvesting sweet potatoes, pulling corn, a very labor intensive childhood with her family. And she taught herself to quilt around the age of 12, 13, watching her grandmother make them. So again, this connection to the past, this connection to history and to family. And as we were talking about before, this is really something that's a shared history that's passed down and comes from this really familial place. So I wonder if you notice anything different about this quilt from what we looked at before. If you want to add those to the chat too, what observations, what discoveries are you making about this? Are there colors that the artist is using only once or twice? What shapes we're noticing? Someone's noticing it's very vertical, almost like planting fields. So very interesting. So maybe drawing upon her history, her background as a child working in the fields, seeing letters. So maybe there's hidden messages in here. Very vertical. They're longer. It almost looks like a maze. These are all really thoughtful observations. Thank you so much for playing around in this space of observing. The color of sweet potato, the blue, a little bit of blue. Yes, 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 yes. Let me bring up a picture of our artist, of our quilter here. This is Mary L. Bennett. And yeah, her family history perhaps, or her own childhood might perhaps be dictating some of what she is putting into her quilt. So here we are just sort of gathering and picking up ideas. This is all going to support and help us brainstorm when we get to our own art making. I'm going to introduce you to one more quilter, Missouri Petway. Missouri's dates are 1902 to 1981. And this is a very, very special quilt. We'll talk a little bit about it in the next slide. But she farmed with her parents as a young person, as a young child, beginning when she was 12. She had 12 children. She lived a very difficult life. There was a lot of hardship. You can describe a lot of the families, and she's been as having lives of great hardship, a lot of work, very labor intensive. And she would piece up quilts out of old pant legs and shirt sleeves, really anything that she could find. And it was all about reusing and repurposing clothing materials and giving them a second life as a quilt. And this was very intentional for many of these quilt makers, is to reuse and repurpose. And this particular quilt holds a lot of meaning. And I'm going to jump over to, this is a picture of Missouri Petway. Sorry, it's a little bit granular, the way it got stretched out. But I'm bringing in this quote here to share a little bit about the meaning and the symbolism behind this particular quilt. And I wonder if there is someone who would be so kind to just unmute to share this quote, to read this quote out loud. It's a quote from her daughter describing her mother. You don't have to raise your hand. Go ahead and just unmute if I can get one volunteer.
It was when Daddy died. I was about 17, 18. He stayed sick about 8 months and passed on. Mama say, I'm going to take his work clothes, shape them into a quilt to remember him, and cover up under it for love. She take his old pants legs and shirt tails, take all the clothes he had, just enough to make that quilt. And I helped her tore it up. Bottom of the pants is narrow, top is wide, and she had me cutting the top part out and to shape them up in even strips.
Fantastic. Thank you so, so much for volunteering and sharing. Yeah. Cover up under it for love. What are you taking away from this sharing from Missouri's daughter? Dr. G posted, powerful example of artistic transmutation. Here you can really see how the history of her family is embedded. It's literally stitched into this quilt to remember the death of Missouri's husband, the death of this Missouri's daughter's father. Yeah, this sentimental recycling, how these everyday objects that are works of art, as well as things that we use every day, can help support and remind us about our family history of who we are, where we come from. History isn't everything. That's really lovely. I love that. That could be like a quote on a t-shirt. Memory made concrete and visible. Yeah, gives me chills. Yes, it absolutely does. It's something so profound and powerful to think about how you can take loss and make it into something beautiful and acknowledge that it's all meant for love, this connection. Thank you for indulging in that thinking exercise with me. So as we transition to our art activity, again, we're flying through this because I want to give us time to create and time to make. I want us to consider how personal history can be a form of activism. So I'm going to jump over. Oh, this is just another quilt that Missouri Petway made, just so you could see another example of that. Oh yes, Denise, connecting to on a personal level from quilts. Yes, absolutely. I want us to think about this, this idea about how we can consider how quilts for the quilt makers of G's Bend have really strengthened the community and that they live in, and how it's also strengthened their personal ties, their familial ties. And so I want us to dwell on this question of the connection between personal identity, personal history, and activism, and how can having a strong sense of self, of our identity, and where we come from be a form of activism. So let's play with those ideas for a second, and let's pop that into the chat as you have something that's percolating, that's coming to mind. Because often when we think of activism, at least for me, I have these associations with very outward activities, marching in the streets, casting a vote in an election, joining an affinity group, a group of like-minded people who want to advocate for certain needs that are not being met. So how could perhaps having a strong sense of self be a form of activism, this more inward exercise? As you're thinking about that, or any ideas that are coming to mind, if there are any sort of bigger ideas than what might fit in a chat, go ahead and just unmute and share. Yeah, community cohesion, refusing to be silenced and forgotten, refusal of erasure. These are so powerful. Refusing to be absorbed into the hegemonic Uber culture, preserving our identities our ancestors have given us. This is so beautiful. A strong sense of self is a form of activism because a person is declaring and owning a sense of themselves on an individual's own terms. Yeah, acknowledging that you are autonomous, you own your history, you own your family history, having pride in who you are, despite culture inviting us to assimilate. Survival, you are visible. Wow, these are blowing my mind. This is really, really powerful. Making ourselves visible when the world tries to silence and erase us. Oh my goodness. Thank you for dwelling in this space of thinking about these connections between identity and activism here. Oh, these are so beautiful. Julie, I hope that we're able to save the chat so that we can all maybe even like share these, or maybe I can type them up and share them out. So let's try to hold the chat, because this is these thoughts are really powerful. And I often think a lot about, what can I do, or what can my students do? We're young people. How can we be activists in our space? And I think a really wonderful grounding place to start from is just knowing who you are, inviting your parents or your caregivers to tell stories about where they come from or their childhoods, and inviting that to be a part of your own family history or your own personal history. Having a strong sense of self can be a form of helping yourself develop a sense of strong self-esteem, and it can really support and be this catalyst for resilience building. Knowing who you are and valuing who you come from can be this catalyst to take those next steps, to go from that inward place of identity to that outward place of advocating, community ties, community connections. I'm seeing a hand from Dr. Carla. Do you want to unmute and share a little bit about what's on your mind?
Hi, sure. Good day, everyone. Thank you for having me, Dena. Thank you all. I would also say that this is a form of activism in terms of owning the sense of self, owning the identity, because there's so much power in a person telling their story, telling their history, just articulating the lived experiences of yourself, of your family, and of your community. And of course, there are people who don't even want to hear the stories, who don't even want to hear the lived experiences. So for a person to be able to own that and then have the courage to say it, to share it, to express it, I mean, that's extremely powerful.
Yes. And as you were sharing, I'm thinking a lot about how communities are often overgeneralized, or we can make broad sweeping generalizations about a certain population or certain community or certain neighborhood, this neighborhood. And when we invite us to actually go inside ourselves and find the individual stories, the unique stories that define us, we really understand that it's not just this monolithic community. It's not just one story to represent many, but it's many stories to represent all the different families, all the different legacies. And I think that's one of the beautiful stories that come from the quilts and the quilt makers from Gee's Bend, is that each of them represent something. And you might, I can imagine these quilters sitting together and pulling out a strip and saying, this was from, these were pants that my husband wore, or these were the pants that we wore in the field, or this was a clothing that I dressed my child in, and that being extremely, extremely powerful. So I think there's a lot of really beautiful images that come to mind and that these quilts can represent. And I think another sort of to conclude this little mini thought exercise is this idea that we are being defiantly present by allowing ourselves to have a strong sense of self and inviting those stories in, that we are present. We are not going to allow our personal histories to be cast to the side or made invisible by broad sweeping generalizations made in different communities. So what a really special way to connect, for us to be able to connect to these quilts from this very physical level of experiencing the quilters and the fabrics that they come from, but also thinking a little bit about what they can mean to us and how they can teach and inform us. So with all of that, and again, Julia, let's be sure to capture these quotes. I want us to create. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, which means I can see all of you a little bit better, which is very nice. And I want us to go back to our warm-up exercise. I want you to return that to that memory that you chose, whatever it was, from your childhood, from your current life, whatever it is, and the 3 symbols that you wrote down on your piece of paper that you used to describe that memory. And look at what you wrote. And just for the sake of time, why don't you go ahead and circle 2 of those symbols? We're going to be creating rough sketches. Does not have to look perfect at all, but just something rough to capture that symbol on paper. So maybe you want to pick 2 that you feel like you could probably sketch with. And we're going to be applying 1 symbol per page. So for the sake of today, because again, we're going to be wrapping up at 12:55, and I want us to have a little bit of dialogue too after, or after we indulge in some creating, go ahead and just pick 2 for today. So you'll just need 2 sheets of paper. And I'm actually going to flip my camera over to my art camera so you can see me. So hopefully I'm still spotlit. Hopefully you're seeing my sketchbook here. I've got my pencil here. And because today really is all about exploring this lesson and not creating a final perfect product, we're going to focus on just getting basic ideas down on paper. Again, like I said at the beginning, with your students, you might allot more time to create. And as we're about to dive into making a little bit, I'll warn you to not get too attached to or invested in these sketches that we're making, because we are going to be, just like a quilter, cutting them up a little bit and creating a little bit of a paper quilt together. So I want you to just identify one of your sketches, and I'm actually going to draw in black so you all can see. And I'm going to change my nameplate so that you can truly see as much as you can of my paper as well. So I'm just changing it to my first name only. So I want you just to identify one of those symbols and pick one piece of paper and just because my paper is pretty large, I'm going to create a little frame for myself. So I know I'm just going to draw inside the frame and not stress too much about making it really big or trying to fill the whole page. So you might want to do something similar. Hopefully you're all seeing that. And I'm going to think about I'm going to look back to my piece of paper to my first symbol, and I'm going to draw my first symbol within this first square on my single sheet of paper. So the memory I chose is of visiting my grandmother's neighbor when my sisters and cousins and I were little. And like my grandma, he was an elderly man and he cared about us as though we were his own grandchildren. And something that he was famous for in the neighborhood was his flag collection. He had this flagpole in his front yard. And my cousins and sisters and siblings and I, we always loved visiting him and getting to choose a flag to raise up on the flagpole. So from that little vignette, that little story, I'm actually going to draw a flagpole in my little sheet of paper. And I'm just going to draw it kind of large so you can see. Here's my little tassel where you would raise the flag. And then, so go ahead and just pick whatever symbol or whatever memory you have and just draw like a basic shape of it. Think about this a little bit like an icon, something that you might find on your phone, like an app icon, if that helps. It doesn't have to be this perfect symbol or a perfect drawing. Again, we're going to be cutting this up. So if you want to just be drawing in black and white or in color, you can choose to do whichever you'd like. Color could be really fun to invite your students to engage with, but of course, use whatever materials you have available in your classroom. So again, on your first piece of paper, you'll draw your first symbol. Don't worry about it being too detailed. If you want to add color, great. If not, black and white is great too. So this is my first piece of paper. As you're working, I'm just going to move on to, I can just continue to demo this and make sure that we keep on track and keep pace of time. So I've got my second piece of paper, and for my second symbol, and again, I'm going to draw just a square that I'm going to use as my frame because this is quite a large piece of paper that I'm working off of. For my second piece of paper, for my symbol, I'm going to draw short lines going up and down using a green marker to represent the grassy lawn that the flagpole was standing on. And if you're wondering about where we're headed with this exercise, and if you're wondering if you want to add color into this, you can, because we're actually going to be cutting these up and creating our own memory quilts based on the memories that you've chosen. So that's where we're headed. And of course, if we had more time, or if you had time in your classroom, you might end up inviting them to add a third memory or a fourth memory. And maybe it's a memory associated with taste or a memory associated with smell. So you can really invite and engage the five senses here as a way of inviting your students to think like really creatively. And again, when you're working with your students, encourage them to think about things that are relatively easy to draw. This doesn't have to be a frustrating experience. Maybe it's a color that you're strongly associating with a memory. Color can bring out really strong memories, really strong sensations for people. So I'm going to pause there. And I've got my two memories on sheets of paper. And then I've got my final sheet of paper here, which is where I'm going to create my quilt. So I'm moving quickly. I totally acknowledge that. Again, as I said before, this is just to really whet our palettes, our creative mindsets to get started, but I in no shape expect us to finish this today. But it's just an opportunity to really get started and to play with the creative process and some of the ideas that we're taking away from the G's Ben quilts. So using your spare piece of paper, your final piece of paper that doesn't have a quilt on it, or sorry, a symbol on it, I want you to sketch or draw a large rectangle just around the edge. And hopefully that's coming up. Maybe it's a little bit soft. I'm going to draw with a thicker side of my marker. So this is going to be the border of your personal memory quilt. And again, if you were in a classroom, you would hopefully wait for everyone, give them the time to finish their memories first. or let them demo and kind of, or you would demo and then let them work at their own pace, depending on the age group of your students. This is going to be the border of my quilt. Of course, I can go back and make it as decorative as we can, like we looked at with Mary Lee Bendolf's. And I'm going to take my, my symbols, and I'm going to cut them into strips and cut them into shapes, and I'm going to add to my quilt. Similar to how I might ask a young one, if I were, you know, in G-Spend working, I might ask a younger one to cut them into strips for the mother or the grandmother to start stitching into the quilt. But I've just cut out one of my symbols. This was my grass that I was talking about before, because the flagpole was on this very grassy lawn, and I'm going to cut it up into strips. I might actually get kind of creative and cut them up into triangles, give myself some fun shapes to work with. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with my second symbol on my second sheet of paper. This was my flagpole that I drew to represent that flagpole that was over on the lawn of my grandmother's neighbor's home. It was this really special place where we enjoyed looking at his flag collection and picking a flag that we wanted to hang up for the day on his lawn. So I'm just going to move all my scraps and strips away, clean those up later. And again, I'm just going to take time to cut my flag up into strips. This might be a really frustrating or upsetting experience for some students to have to cut up their beautiful drawings into little strips. So I think if that were the case and you were feeling particularly sensitive about that, because I absolutely acknowledge that, you might consider just inviting them to choose colors associated with a memory. So they're just cutting out certain colors as opposed to certain things that they've taken a lot of time to draw on. But I hope that with your students, you might be able to demo creating something that isn't so precious, so that they feel a little bit comfortable kind of playing around with these shapes. So let me just catch us up with where we're at. And again, wherever you're at is okay. There's no specific pacing. You might end up having to set this aside to just head to the next workshop, or this could be something to sort of do and doodle on in your next workshop. But I've just created 2 pages of symbols. I've cut out my symbols. I've cut them into little strips and different fun shapes that felt really fun for me. And the next step of this is to create your quilt out of paper by arranging your memory shapes in whatever pattern you choose within your paper quilt. And you can think about this a lot like a playground where you can play around with the placement of your shapes. What looks good next to something else? You need to flip a shape around to kind of make it fit or match. Are you going to play around with this idea of pattern and repetition, kind of getting in some math techniques in there with your students? Are you going to, do you see a shape that you've cut out that you might need to cut down even more so that you can make it fit in a certain area? Because you can imagine as a quilter, if you need just the perfect piece or just the perfect size, that you might need to adjust your fabric to do that. So allow your students, and I'll allow you now, to just play and invite them to organize and order their shapes in whatever pattern that they want. You can play around with getting crazy shapes. You can invite them to think about making wavy lines with their scissors if they're working with scissors, if they want to create whatever, whatever is inspiring them in that moment. So as you're working, you might invite them to think back to the quilters that we met. Mary L. Bennett and Mary Lee Bendolf both worked very improvisationally. Mary Lee Bendolf called them crazy quilts because she just sort of added these pieces in whatever order felt really good to her at the time, or these patterns that looked really great. And here in this exercise, you're inviting your students to think like a quilter and to even use math and repetition to consider pattern and shape placement. This kind of exercise of thinking like a quilter, thinking like an artist, is this wonderful way of helping them connect to these identities, connect to these professions. I love this, Alka. Thank you. Crazy quilt is a common term for free-form quilts. Yes, working improvisationally, working very intuitively in that through that process. So, I'll say, and again, whatever stage you're at is perfectly perfect. Please do not stress about any doneness by the end of our session, but for the sake of our time and having some time to debrief, I'll just say that after you invite your students to lay out their pieces on their piece of paper, you can invite them to just begin by gluing them down piece by piece within whatever set layout that they determined would be most satisfying for them. And again, whatever materials you have in your classroom or in your context, glue sticks, tape, liquid glue, whatever works for your learners is whatever material is going to be great for this project, whatever you have. Another way to access this, if you want to invite them to cut out pieces from the newspaper from that day or a favorite magazine, that can be a really wonderful way to engage elements of different textures, like we thought about with the corduroy and the wool. So there's a lot of ways that we can play around with this exercise. So yes, this workshop goes till 12:55. So in our final 10 minutes, I do want to return to my screen share so that we can think about how we can take this back to our classroom, or maybe what classroom connections you are making that you can take back with you to your context. So I'll kind of begin and then hopefully we can just use this as an entry point for everyone or anyone who would like to jump in and share a little bit about how you might apply this to your context wherever you teach. But this is a project that I think you can link to history, post-Civil War history about the area of Gee's Bend. I think you can connect it if you're looking for a math lesson that has a lot of creativity in it, an art lesson, American geography, thinking about different geographic regions of the US and histories or artistic legacies that come from those regions. Gee's Bend is significant for their quilts. Basic history lesson. I'll also add that if you are a local educator and you have the capacity to bring your students or to come on your own time too, these quilts are on view at the National Gallery of Art, which is where I work, within the Call to Create Black Artists of the American South exhibition, which is going on through March 26th. And I'll also add that this activity is so scalable. If you're working with an early childhood setting, you could invite them to explore shape play without focusing on the final product being glued down, just inviting them to move shapes around and match them like you would a puzzle. You can invite those shapes to be fabric or paper, whatever materials you have on hand. It could be one giant piece of paper that the students contribute a mural to. Invite them to play with an order and arrangement of shapes. And you can also invite your students to share, if they're younger, memories or ideas associated with certain colors. Like I mentioned before, colors can be a very powerful tool for students. For older students, it can be paired with a short writing exercise or artist statement about the memory they chose to focus on, their personal family history or their own identity, and how this quilt might represent some of those elements as well. So those are a couple of thoughts that I had for younger students, and then scaling it to older. I wonder too, especially if you have more time, you can invite them to add more memories to their quilts to make it this really powerful, potent quilt. As we're working, I wonder if folks either want to share out what memory they're working on right now, or how they might take this back to their classroom, something that they're really holding on to. That would be wonderful. So again, this does not need to be a final product, but as folks are just working, it might be nice to have a couple people share out. If you'd like to raise your hand or even just unmute, you can just make this sort of a
memory I'm working on is my siblings and I, when we were growing up together. We lived in a 2-story home, and me and my sister shared a room, and we had twin beds, and my brother had his own room. However, for like grades, 3rd grade all the way up until I was a freshman in high school, all 3 of us would squeeze onto my twin bed and sleep together, and we would just talk about our dreams. And my bed was by a window, so we just look at the stars, and we just talk to each other and talk about the things that we wanted to do and grow up with. So that's my memory quilt, and I chose like a star, a shooting star, and a bed to symbolize that memory I have.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so, so much for taking the time to share. Denise, I see your hand. You can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, so I actually have a program I do with kids called Quilt Portraits My Life Matters, but I bring them through different exercise in this. I love the idea of integrating this, or doing something a little different. I love this. And one thing I was thinking is you could ask the kids to make a shape from these first two symbols that they cut up into the third symbol.
Mm,
Yeah.
I love
So I'm excited about using it. My memory was my dad and I were walking around a lake early one morning. He's a birder, and I was a kid, and we came around a corner, and there were three men who had been sitting in their chairs, and they had a very fierce barking, huge German Shepherd that came lunging at us. And so my symbols were the big tent that they had, a tree, and the dog.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's powerful. I like that you also brought in this sense of sound to your memory. Thank you so much, Denise. Lynette, I see you holding something beautiful up.
Oh, Lynette.
I wrote in the chat that this was a memory from years ago when my favorite uncle, who has passed on now, came and took me to the circus. And I remember a song that was playing on the radio, and every time I hear it, I think about that day. And it was special because he was in the military and he wasn't often home on leave. So it was very special, and he was my favorite. So it's a heart and a music note that I cut up.
That's so nice. Thank you so much. And I love that it has this direct reference to somebody that you're connected to. Yeah. I don't know if folks want to just hold up what they've created so far. If you've got a lot of fragments and pieces that are falling, maybe we could do like a quick screenshot. Lindsay, thank you for popping that into the chat. We read the picture book Belle and the Last Mule at Gee's Bend. Yeah. As part of our study of MLK in my third grade classroom, we watch videos about the artists and look at pictures of the quilts. I bring in some of my great grandmother's quilts for the kiddos to touch and explore. We talk about traditions. This will be a great activity to add. Yeah, it's wonderful to hear that you're already connecting to the quilts from Gee's Bend, and this is just another way to enhance that. Thank you, Jen, for popping some ideas into the chat as well. And thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, inviting your students to be independent, autonomous thinkers, to know that whatever memory is coming to mind or whatever connection they're making to their families is a wonderful connection, and inviting those to be valued by themselves and their classmates, and you as well, supporting that. See, Amin W, I saw you holding something up in case you wanted to share. Feel free to unmute if you'd like, no pressure.
I grew up in Brooklyn, and my memory was that we would play after in the evening. And so we could play between the tree and the fire hydrant. So I drew the tree to the fire hydrant. And because I have to add more color before I move on to the next stage, I've just taken notes on what the next stage is of making the quilt piece, because there's lots of color to go in there.
Yeah.
What I enjoyed about the process was that respect of my own life being in the city, can even create a beautiful quilt, what I usually think of as being more of a country thing. So it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. And thank you for continuing to add these to the chat. Hopefully this is connecting or inspiring other folks as these are popping through and filtering in. There's lots of resources on Gee's Bend out there. A quick Google can find so many really great resources. And then I will just wrap up.
And our final moments together. I know this went super quick, just by saying thank you all so much for engaging in such thoughtful listening and thinking, and as well as creating. And I'm popping my information into the chat. Again, my name is Dena Rapaport, and I work at the National Gallery of Art. So if you would like to be in touch, would like more information about where the exhibition is, if you're local and want to see it before it closes in a month, in 2 months, happy to help direct that information there. So copy the information before the chat room or before the room closes. And otherwise, we've got 1 minute to spare in case anyone would like to unmute and share what they're working on or share their memory. Otherwise, I want to thank you all so much. This always flies by. But it was really fun to see how and meaningful to see how much we could really pack into just these 50 minutes together. So thank you again for indulging in this creative space together and creating community in this way. And I hope you have a really, really wonderful rest of our curriculum fair. And hope you have a really wonderful next session. Thanks, everyone.